Okay, it's right around 8:31, and welcome to week 10 of Introduction to Corrections. This quarter has moved pretty fast, and the quarter will be over next week. This will be our last lecture. I wanted to make sure that I go over some things with you for this week, and then let you know that next week there will not be a lecture. This is the final lecture, so let's get right into class. Okay, let's look down at the lecture schedule. You can see that the last scheduled lecture is week 10, which is taking place right now. I will have an archive of that lecture emailed to you, as well as posted in the course home page. Okay, let's look at our week 10 lecture announcement. Juvenile offenders. We'll talk a little bit about juvenile offenders, and to prepare for that, section 13, I sent you the PowerPoints for that as well. And then complete the activity, the juvenile justice system, historical perspective, major cases, and so forth. I'll go over that with you, and juvenile vocabulary. And then your initial post was due last night, 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time, the role of juvenile probation officers. Many of you have done pretty good with that. And then your reply post is due this Saturday at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. And then your written assignment, your state's waiver process, and the quiz. I'll go over the state waiver process in a few minutes. The quiz, as I constantly remind students, try to take that at the end of the week so that you will have gone through the materials as well, okay? And then let's finish strong. And remember my motto, adversity is a springboard to success, which I shared during the open house as to what that's all about. Okay, let's take a look at the course calendar. Okay, and you can see that your reading assignment, your initial post, lecture, reply post due the 9th, your quiz due the 10th, and your written assignment due the 10th. Then next week, your reading assignment, your initial post due Tuesday, and the quarter ends on the 15th. You will have a written assignment and your final exam. It must be, I repeat, it must be submitted by 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time on the 15th. If it is on the 16th, you're not going to get credit for it. That's something that's very important. So you should be aware of that. Okay, so let's look at our module. First, again, let's go through the assignments, and then I will present to you the requirements. 2 pages, not 1, but 2 pages. Determine what your court's process for the transfer and trying of juvenile offenders in adult cases. What is your waiver process? Include your state and the information. And here is the rubric for that. Due Sunday the 10th, and it tells you precisely what you need to do. 2 pages, okay? Include statutory exclusions in your state that mandate automatic transfer to adult court. And then, of course, make sure that it's the 2 pages required, because you will lose points here if not. Make sure citations are throughout the body of your paper. Don't throw one or two citations in there. And then many of you lose points because of APA. I have said from day one, and I say it over and over, and I say it every time we have a lecture, APA requires citations in the body and references at the end and a cover sheet. It is so important, and this is in your rubric, which you've had every week, and this part is consistent. This part up here changes depending on the assignment, the quality, content, and accuracy. But the organization of content, grammar, and punctuation is always the same. It is the same. And you should be familiar with following that process so you can maximize and get all of your 25 points. Imagine this. You can do this well. You can do this, meet the 2 pages. But if you don't have citations and references, you're going to lose 5 points. So that'll put you at 20 points. So you don't, that's a whole grade down. So you don't want to do that, okay? I've stressed that over and over again. 2 pages, okay? And then it tells when it's due. Then, of course, your initial posts, as I already told you. Then your quiz. It's a time quiz. So you want to make sure you do that. Now, before I get into the module, I want to go to 11 just to show you something. Again, your assignments for next week. It's a 1 to 2 page paper. Conducting research on the latest technological tools available to correctional professionals, not law enforcement professionals, but correctional professionals. All right? And make sure you have the same requirements met. Again, there's a rubric for that. And it tells you conduct internet research on some of the latest technological tools. And in a 1 to 2 page paper, explain these tools. Make sure that you run your papers through Grammarly as well, so you don't get a Grammarly hit. Don't worry about the meets the 2 page minimum requirement because it's 1 to 2 pages. If you do 1 page, I won't take off points, okay, in this assignment. Then, but I will take off points if there's neither citations or references, or if there's only citations, only references, or if there's only references and no citations, you will lose 5 points. Okay? So then, for week 11, again, since there's no lecture, you have your discussion posts, and I told you when they're due, and then your final exam, 40 multiple choice questions and true-false questions, 40-minute exam, and you want to make sure that you do well on that as well, okay? That usually involves the last part of the course, so you want to make sure you do well on that, okay? Take your time, but get those answers. All right, so now let's go back to Module 10. And let's spend a little time talking about juveniles. Again, there's your assignment. So in the juvenile justice system, you should be aware that we operate on what we call the English concept of parens patriae, which meant that the rights of the kids, we were watching out for the individual rights of the kids and to protect the kids. And in today's court, the same thing occurs. With the court stepping in as parents, the judge, the probation officer, the parole officer, and all of those stepping in to help. And the system is similar to the adult system, except in the juvenile justice system, you'll notice that there's no finding of guilty. There's adjudication, and you'll generally see not the people of the state of Illinois versus, but in re whatever the name of that person is. The process begins with a petition, not an indictment. There is no indictment, and juveniles, as you will see here, are taken into custody. There's no arrest. However, when they are taken into custody and they're not free to go, they are afforded the Miranda warnings. So they have a right to remain silent. Anything they say can and will be used against them. They have the right to an attorney, and if they can't afford one will be appointed, and then asking them, do they understand those rights? Anyway, so they're taken into custody. They're detained, not jailed. Some people might say, well, what's the difference? It's the process of how it's viewed. They're adjudicated, but not found guilty, and given a disposition and not a sentence. The whole theory of the process is to give these kids a chance to learn from their mistakes that they commit in juvenile offenses, unless they are tried as adults, and keep them to the point that they don't grow into adult offenders. Since probation is ordered for an indefinite period of time, and juvenile probation officers play an important role. Basically, they do the same kind of things as adult offenders: investigation, prepare a report, but the juvenile offenders are based on their risk and needs, what they need primarily, and they're what we call case plans that are provided to provide the services that are necessary. Remember, we're focusing more on rehabilitation than penalization of our juveniles. And the juvenile officer and the juvenile probation officer works closely with the family to help that juvenile to matriculate back into society, so that juvenile does not grow into a hardened criminal. And juveniles can be placed out of the home for a number of reasons. They have group homes, wilderness programs, boot camps, and some even require secure detention. Those are the most serious and probably extreme repeat offenders. And treatment ranges from education and other services, again, to try to help that young person to go in a new direction. Non-residential programs are those where the youth remains at home but is required to go to school or receive treatment if there's a drug problem, and other services in the community. May do community service, serving in organizations such as churches or other kinds of community groups. Now, if the offense is a heinous crime, then that juvenile could be transferred to adult court. And many jurisdictions have waiver systems, which you will be writing your paper about this week. And each state has a different one. But the key thing is that it only deals with serious offenses. In that instance, adult sanctions, including prison, now apply. Now, remember this: when it comes to prison, they send the individual not to the adult facility. They want to send it to a youth facility that's a prison to keep them away, because you know what would happen? You take a young person in the adult prison, and what happens is that individual becomes as we say, how should I say, meat for the adult. The adult uses that juvenile or youth. And, but there are still a lot of problems because, as you and I both know, there are so many youth committing violent offenses that has resulted in increased incarceration. So therefore, we have crowding, violence, and exploitation by adult offenders. And as I said earlier, they try to keep them out of adult facilities, but there are some situations they can't avoid it. They can't avoid it. Now, know this. The other thing is that because many of the youthful offenders that go in and are transferred to the adult courts are affiliated with gangs. And so they find themselves dealing with the violence that take place in the prison. Plus, to be honest with you, the juvenile then learns how to become a criminal so that when they do come out, they're hardened more of a criminal than they were before they went in. And so there's some things that jurisdictions are trying to work with, including house arrest and electronic monitoring options. However, they're not coming too fast. And once again, the key thing is that those individuals who are hardcore to have reached a stage where they are waived to adult court or transferred to adult court and tried as adults are dealing with very, 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 very serious offenses. There, when you get to that location, parents' patriae doesn't exist anymore. Okay. So here are some cases that set the stage for how the juvenile system operates. And over the years, certain rights have occurred. Starting with 1966 in Kent versus United States, where the United States Supreme Court determined that the courts must provide due process in transferring juveniles to the adult system. In other words, they had to have a hearing. They had an opportunity to respond and try to justify keeping them in the juvenile justice system as opposed to transferring them to the adult system. So Kent was a landmark case that happened in 1966. Then in 1967, in Ray Galt, a famous case, that said that in hearings that result in commitment to institutions, juveniles have various rights, 4 basic constitutional rights: to timely notification of the charges, the right to confront witnesses, the right against self-incrimination, and the right to counsel. These were the rights that were afforded adults, and so the Supreme Court spoke that even in juvenile hearings, that individuals were entitled to each of these constitutional rights. Then in 1970, in Ray Winship, in delinquency matters, the state must prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So the standard is the same in criminal court as it is in juvenile court. In the following year, another landmark, McKeever versus Pennsylvania, says there are no jury trials. Jury trials are not constitutionally required in juvenile court proceedings. Once again, one of the things about juvenile court hearings is that they're closed, they're not open to the public, and that, remember, again, because of the parents' patriae situation, the court has stepped in and determined what's in the best interest of the minor to deal with a disposition for that individual. Juries are not going to be able to do that and are not, how should I say, prepared to do that. And so therefore, in the McKeever case, it's a very interesting case if you ever get a chance to read it. It makes a whole lot of sense. Some people objected to it, But remember, once again, if that individual is transferred into adult court, then they do have a right to a jury trial. Reed versus Jones, the waiver of a juvenile to criminal court following adjudication in juvenile court constitutes double jeopardy, which means that you can't try them twice for the same offense in both courts. That's what it amounts to. Daily versus, Smith versus Daily Mail Publishing. Remember I said it was a closed session. The press may report juvenile court proceedings in certain instances, but when they do so, they don't report the name. They'll put John Doe or somebody. They won't use the name of that individual in reporting those cases, but they are limited in what they can report. Eddings versus Oklahoma. A defendant's youthful age is considered a mitigating factor determining whether to apply the death penalty. Of course, though, you're going to find out in a little bit that has changed as well. You'll see it at the very end in 2005. But at the time, 82, the age is a mitigating factor. In other words, discourage using the death penalty for juveniles and youth. That's what it was saying. And in 84, Shaw versus Martin, preventative pretrial detention of juveniles is allowed under certain circumstances. So in other words, juveniles could be held, and not entitled to be released on bail, and based on the Shaw versus Martin case. Then we get to 88. The minimum age for the death penalty is set at 16. So Thompson versus Oklahoma. And then the landmark case, Roper versus Simons, absolutely says the minimum age for death penalty is set at 18. So what does that mean? That means juveniles could not be sentenced to the death penalty. Now, what happened before 2005 is that each of the states had the right to determine whether or not they would have the death penalty, which they still do now. However, each of the states also had the right as to whether or not they would impose the death penalty on juveniles based on the previous cases. But in 2005, the Supreme Court came out and said no death penalty for juveniles, no matter how heinous the crime. If an individual commits a crime and they're 17 and under, then at the time of the offense, then they could not be sentenced to death. And that's the law even right now. Okay. So then there's, let's get to the vocabulary. Parens patriae, we kind of talked about that, but just to give you a Latin term describing when English kings established the right to intervene in the lives of the children. And that's what the courts started doing, is operating this in the place of the king on behalf of the youth that came before them. Okay. Juvenile delinquent, that meant that minors who violate criminal law are those are incorrigible, truant, or runaway. So you're called a juvenile delinquent. Status offender is a juvenile who engages in behavior that is illegal only because of their age. Because of their age. Community treatment pretty much describes what happens to provide protection services for juveniles, such as probation, counseling, restitution. You could even include education in that as well. Institutional treatment is that facilities operated by the state or the county restrict movement of residents through staff monitoring, locked exits, and interior fence controls. So in other words, it's like in a prison situation. That's where the juvenile is placed in that situation. Residential programs, on the other hand, use social services or group homes, family group homes, wilderness programs, boot camps. In other words, they take the youth and try to show them some pretty tough situations and discourage them from committing crimes in the future, particularly with these boot camps. Boot camps are good because what they do is they take these kids out and they place them in categories almost as if the person was in the military, and they're forced to follow the rules of the institution strictly, such as when they have to get up and they have to follow the procedures, exercises, and so forth. Wilderness programs takes them into an area outside of the normal environment that they're accustomed to. As you'll discover, many juveniles are from urban areas, and wilderness is the opposite of what they're accustomed to. Non-residential programs, the offender don't stay there overnight. They're able to go home. Aftercare is like parole. After they finish, it's not called parole, it's called aftercare, where they're under the operation of someone similar to a parole officer and have to follow the rules set forth by the board. Judicial waiver, intake personnel, prosecutors, or judges who make a decision to try a juvenile in adult court. So that gets to your waiver system in your jurisdictions, which vary. Social investigation part, it's like the pre-sentence investigation, and it just gives the background history of the individual, their criminal history or lack of criminal history, number of times they've been incarcerated or charged or tried, and so forth. And then finally, statutorial exclusion, law in certain states that automatically transfer juvenile offenders to adult court for certain offenses. And that's what that is, automatically. So you commit a certain offense, you will automatically be transferred under the state law. So some states have it and some don't. And that's the end of that. Okay. And so, as you can see, juveniles are treated in such a way that we want to salvage them. We want to give them an opportunity to be able to operate on the basis of continuing to live in society, and we find ways to try to help them and keep them out of the criminal justice system as adults. And so with that, I'm going to say it's been a pleasure teaching this class again. I will be teaching this class in the summer again, and hopefully not many of you will be in that class, because that means you passed this class. And I will be falling a little bit behind on the grading. I had a special assignment that kind of pushed me a little bit, but this week I will work very hard to catch up on your grading. If you have any questions about your grading or concerns, email me or call me or text me. It would be better to call me or to text me, because then it'll be easier or faster for me to respond back to you. If you do text me, make sure you include your name, of course, and include the class that you're in. This is J115, Introduction to Corrections. And then I'll be able to look up and see who you are. But again, please don't contact me to ask me what does it take now for me to pass this course. At this point, I've announced that at the beginning of the course, what it would take then. If you do your assignments, if you follow the rubric, that's the key. You have the rubric laid out. The rubric is the foundation and key to getting your written assignments and getting them in on time. And if you had some circumstances that are extenuating regarding getting your assignments in on time, I needed to know those. And a lot of you, unfortunately, decided to take the route of emailing me that. If I had an extenuating circumstance, I would reach out if my professor was like me and offered allowed texts and phone calls. Man, I'd be right on that right away and wouldn't hesitate to do it. Might back it up with the email, but my key thing is to get that resolved right away. So anyway, some of you have had a real serious problem with the project. I spent an extensive amount of time week 1 going over the project, giving you every step from A to Z, letting you know about what was expected in week 2, week 4, week 7, and then week 9. And you have the rubrics as well. And remember that each of your assignments there are not cumulative. They're dependent on what each of them have different requirements. So some students have said, I need to know how I did in week 7 to know, well, week 9, you would need to know those. But as far as week 7, that's an interview. The interview questions, some students couldn't find them. The interview questions were given in week 1, and they were in the module, and they're still there. And if you, for example, were to have gone back, and just for a minute here, I want to just show you something. It was there all the time. I want to go back to module 1 and show you what I'm talking about when it comes to the project. We go to the lesson content in week 1, and then we get down here and we here's the project overview, where I told you what the topics were that were required, the 4, probation, parole, jail, or prison, and none other. I broke it down by going over all of this section, however, and I told you what the due dates were for week 2, week 4, week 7, week 9, what each week 2 was very easy. Week 4 was basically research. You didn't even have to have done the interview by week 4. But by week 7, you should have lined up the interview. So you should have started setting up your interview in week 2. And then your final report consists of each of these all included along with the other requirements that are in the rubric. But here's the interview questions. Requirements, interview questions. There they are, 5 of them, and then 3, a minimum of 3 of your choice. So it should be 8. And I didn't need them numbered 1 through 5. I wanted them, laid out so that I know that you're answering the questions. You could even capture these with this and then write your information under it section by section, as long as it was narrative and not a list. And then research into the agency based on the agency selected. These costs per day, population, this was for week number 4. And you provide the missions and so forth and so on. And then that, you go on from there, okay, your final submission after that. So you have them each broken down already right here. So that's where you find them. There are students that say, I can't find them. That's because you didn't go and listen to the open house, or you didn't go back, started with week 1. And that is where some of you have had problems as I graded them, and I still have some that I'm grading now. Just so you know, that's where your problems were. and I spent a lot of time laying it out to you. Then those of you who missed the APA, I already said that you citations and references and cover sheet, not or, and you lose points for that. And so with all of that being said, I share all of that with you from beginning all the way to end, full 10 weeks, and for all weeks, I provided all the details you need and made myself available and continue to make myself available to help you. So with that, I'm going to say good night and my best to you. And some of you, I hope to see you in other classes, not repeating this course, but if you have to, you have to. So I'm going to say good night at this time.